and Military Affairs. We're on a new bill now, S-23, an act relating to the use of synthetic media in elections. And we will hear from our first witness from the Secretary of State's office, Lauren or Sean.
Sean's going to testify. Right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Morning. Sean Sheehan, Elections Director at the Secretary of State's office. At least a few days since this last year, so introduce myself.
Yes,
I did, I'm sure you did. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on S-23. The Secretary of State's office supports this bill. We support the disclosure, not the prohibition, as this bill has in place for the use of synthetic media. It covers media within 90 days of an election that's been manipulated to appear realistic using digital technology, including artificial intelligence, to deceive voters or influence the outcome of an election or injure the reputation of a candidate. The bill requires a mandatory disclosure in campaign materials if synthetic media is used. That disclosure says, quote, the media has been created or intentionally manipulated by digital technology or artificial intelligence, end quote. This bill is based on other states' legislation across the nation, and it hasn't been a partisan measure. The bill creates a pathway for impacted candidates to seek injunctive or other equitable relief. Any violation would incur fines based on the severity of intent or impact of the media. And if the election media is intended to incite violence, then the fines would be even higher. Our office supports that escalation of penalties as well. Our office believes there's value for candidates to use artificial intelligence, and that's part of why we support having a disclosure rather than a prohibition. On the positive side, AI can allow candidates with fewer resources to be more efficient and effective in their outreach. And it can also streamline processes that would otherwise be very labor intensive. On the con side, however, we know there's room for abuse and ambiguity. The classic example has been talked a lot in the last year was the case over next door in New Hampshire with a deepfake robocall impersonating President Biden, encouraging voters to stay home during the presidential primary. So we feel it's important that Vermonters have trust in elections, that voters must have notice when election materials use AI. That will promote transparency during an election cycle, and that's why we're in support of the bill.
Questions? Rep. Morgan.
Have you all seen any evidence of much of this happening here? Just curious, just to see, have we seen any level of it here, Vermont?
In Vermont, in the last election, we really didn't have much. Yeah, just on this side.
Yeah. I mean, I understand kind of what it is. I don't think I know 100% what it is. I'll look into it a little bit more, but I see it's that type of thing. It's like fake stuff. Yeah. Gotcha.
Any other questions or comments at this point? Rep. Boyden.
I have a question. I'm still kind of exploring it. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on how the disclosure should be placed, or even I guess over the weekend I saw AI images used, and the disclosure wasn't until the very end of a written post saying that this photo is used creating AI. If someone wanted to ask to see more, to have the post fully go down and also read towards the end of the post, they wouldn't have seen that disclosure. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
If you have any perspective.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point and a great discussion. There was actually a lot of discussion and wordsmithing over on the Senate side about the language, about how disclosure should appear. And it's different for different media as well, as I'm sure the other witnesses will address as well, right, as for how it appears. And so on the on video or audio there's language in there about that it's, at a tone and speed, it has to be, can't be a mile a minute or super, super quiet there, has to be audible. So there was a lot of work done on the Senate side for that, to pay attention. And we think that the language in the bill covers, to make sure it's clear to folks.
Other questions? Nothing online? Okay, thank you.
Great, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Next up, we have Quinn. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Quinn Houston, the Democracy Associate with the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. For over 50 years, VPIRG has been the leading voice in protecting and expanding democracy in Vermont. We support the passage of S23. The disclosure of synthetic media in elections is essential to protecting our voters from misinformation that could affect our elections. Synthetic media or AI media is a rapidly advancing technology, increasingly impacting various aspects of our lives, society, economy, and democracy. In 2024, Vermont enacted H 878, which criminalized non-consensual disclosure of sexually explicit images, which included digitally altered images, like AI deepfakes. This framework just demonstrates Vermont's willingness to take a stand against harmful AI-generated misinformation and setting a precedent for action in the political sphere. Notable cases include, the AI manipulated likeness of Vice President Kamala Harris, illustrate how synthetic media can be weaponized against anyone, including public figures. Expanding Vermont law in the area of elections to include synthetic media and disinformation in all media forms would create additional safeguards for candidates and our democratic institutions. In 2024, we saw numerous instances of deceptive AI content used in the election cycle that received public attention with the intent to mislead voters. A notable example, as Shanshian mentioned, was the deepfake robocall in New Hampshire, which imitated President Joe Biden, dissuading voter turnout ahead of the primary. Another is Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis using AI-generated imagery in a campaign advertisement of opponent President Donald Trump embracing Dr. Anthony Fauci without revealing AI's role. 2023, there was a concocted video presented to Senator Elizabeth Warren claiming that Republicans should be banned from voting. Another is an AI video of President Biden, again, his announcement of a national draft of the Ukraine war that was first labeled a deepfake, but then was circulated without that disclosure. I'm sure that we can all agree that it's vital Vermont residents maintain their trust in the electoral system by ensuring that voters are informed when AI is used in election materials. We can enhance transparency and help maintain that trust. This bill closely examines new forms of deceptive and synthetic media in elections. While you do this, it's essential to remember that free speech is vital. We urge this committee to ensure that any restrictions closely align with the bill's intent to protect voters from misinformation and not censor their voices. And while we recognize that vital importance of protected free speech in our society, we also know that the courts have long understood that there are limits to free speech. I can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And there's a difference between lying in a political speech versus synthetic media fabricating evidence. There's some really good testimony from Public Citizen in the Senate Government Operations. They're a national organization that specializes in this topic. Either hearing them here or watching that testimony, I think would be very helpful. Misinformation about election processes and outcomes can erode public trust in democracy. With synthetic media, false claims can transform into fabricated content indistinguishable from reality, which undermines confidence in elections. It worsens political divides. It enhances, tensions and polarization. It's more important now than ever to protect voters from deceptive and fraudulent synthetic media that can mislead the public. We support the S23 disclosure language that broadly considers the implications of AI's influence, over elections beyond just candidate misrepresentation. One of the amendments in the Senate did this and was really important for that point. Advanced technologies can distort and fabricate people's votes and beliefs. That said, we really urge the legislature to remain vigilant. This is a powerful and potentially dangerous technology. Any reasonable effort to regulate or limit its use are worthwhile, as it poses a real threat to democracy. While we're not calling for an outright ban in this bill, simple disclosure might not address the accessibility issues that AI presents in misleading synthetic content. That can go quickly viral before its authenticity is even questioned. So this is just the first step in a growing problem. And the Senate Committee on Government Operations crafted this legislation after hearing really extensive testimony. And moving forward with this measured approach is important, but it can also be done while we observe what happens in other states that are taking a more aggressive regulatory approach. Passing this bill should not be the end of the conversation. It's reasonable to revisit this issue annually, monitoring developments and considering the best way to curb AI's influence on elections as the technology changes. That includes assessing the mechanics, the scope, and the legal ramifications surrounding this legislation. VPIRG supports this bill. Vermont, must take decisive action to address AI-generated political disinformation to safeguard our democratic processes. This is an essential first step. Thank you for your time and your consideration.
Thank you. Anyone have questions for Quinn? Rep. Nugent?
Thanks for coming in. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that statement you made early on about the difference between lying and fabricating events.
This is something I would really encourage you guys to have Public Citizen on because they are the experts and they describe the difference in the First Amendment where there are protections for saying what you want in political speech. This is an arguable difference with legality, but there's a difference with synthetic media, which can create a piece of media that is like a video that is indistinguishable, and that sort of equates to evidence rather than simply just saying something that isn't true. So I would really encourage that you hear their explanation of why there is a big difference between those two.
Any other questions? Online? Thank you, Quinn.
Thank you.
And we'll now start with Dylan. Morning.
Morning, how are you?
Thanks. How are you?
Doing well. For the record, Dylan Zwicky with Leonine Public Affairs here today on behalf of New England Connectivity and Telecommunications Association, or NECTA. I've been in this building 10 years and I don't think I've ever testified in the House Government Operations Committee, so it's good to be here. NECTA did weigh in the Senate committee and appreciate your counterparts' work to amend the bill to address the concerns that we had raised. Just as a little bit of background, NECTA represents the private cable companies, I think Comcast and Charter. In addition to the delivery of broadband services, they also, in some instances, also operate television stations, I think NBC News. And so as entities that do offer the ability to candidates to sell or to portray political advertising, we did have an interest in this bill, and the committee in the Senate was helpful in addressing some of the concerns we had about liability that could have been placed on local television stations to be the arbiters of what is and is not synthetic media. Just as you all are required by the Secretary of State to disclose in your political advertising that it's paid for by candidate or PAC or party, the onus should be on the political candidate or the party and not on the news station or print media that is going to be printing that political advertising. We, in many cases, do not have the ability to actually determine with 100% certainty what might or might not be synthetic media. And for broadcast stations that are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, and in particular their censorship rule, if you are an FCC licensed entity and you choose to offer the political advertising, you can't discriminate. You can't pick and choose which political ads you offer, and you really would not want any news organization to be choosing which advertising that they're putting out there. And so what we described to the committee in the Senate was a scenario where they received two ads from opposing candidates. There was an allegation of one being synthetic media and from the other campaign, and then you're putting the news organization in the middle, and either pulling that ad down and then facing challenges from the candidate whose ad you pulled down, or not pulling it down and facing allegations that you're in some way picking winners and losers. And so we appreciate the language that was added in the Senate committee. There is one additional, I think, suggestion that you may hear from the broadcasters as well, which is just the addition of some language that basically says, including a commentary of general interest. And that would cover, for example, Vermont This Week, where there may be a discussion about a political ad that's running, and would not want to limit the ability for those types of programs to discuss, analyze, and comment on those advertisements or those ads. So I think it's also in line with some of the other language that's in the bill. Happy to provide that in writing. And again, I think you'll hear from the broadcasters that this would help them out as well.
Any questions for Dylan? Rep. Nugent.
Thank you. Just to clarify, so you're happy with the bill the way it is, and that's what you're.
Yeah, I think would appreciate consideration of adding that additional sentence, but generally we're supportive of these efforts and have seen legislation in other states where NECTA does work that this lines up with.
Any additional questions? Doesn't look like we have any at the moment, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
We also have Wendy.
Good morning, everyone. For the record, Wendy Mays. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Broadcasters. And Dylan stole most of my thunder. No, I'm just kidding. It's not thunder. I don't want to be repetitive and be respectful of your time. So I will try. I did submit written testimony, but what I will just say is that even though S23 will impact broadcasters, and there will need to be a certain amount of education on production procedures that will need to change, we do support S23 as it was passed by the Senate. But we, in particular, again, I'm not trying to say what's already been said, but we do really appreciate the process of amending the bill to address some of our concerns about liability. And like Dylan alluded to, I just want to say again, if anybody has any questions about the Federal Communications Commission and the fact that our industry is very heavily regulated by the FCC, unlike search engines and social media who have zero regulation at all, we are very heavily regulated, and we do have to adhere to the no censorship rule, which means that we cannot alter at all any political ad that is given to us, which would include, the addition of a disclosure, which is why we're really pleased that it is, the bill makes clear that the sense of responsibility is on the candidate or the creator of the media to add that disclosure, so that broadcasters aren't becoming the police of what is and what isn't, because this technology is so good, it is very difficult to discern what is and what isn't. So, and also, Dylan mentioned the equal time rule. So that's another FCC rule that we take very seriously and have to adhere by. So when you put the combination of those two rules together, it means that broadcasters' hands are literally tied if they have accepted political ads from candidate A that are perfectly fine, but then the opponent comes along and says, I want to buy equal time. We have to sell it to them, and we have to air their ad exactly how it's given to us without altering. So that's why we really appreciate the fact that the way that the bill is written right now, it doesn't force broadcasters to choose between federal law and state law. So we really appreciate that. And just to reiterate what Dylan already said, we would appreciate your committee just considering adding the commentary of public interest, a commentary of general interest to the bill. It does already appear in part of the bill. It appears in the part where it talks about print. And we were just hoping to add it back up into the part that talks about television and radio. Because at the time that was questioned in the Senate, I was not able to give them a solid example of what that was. And since then, I have, done a little bit more research and found out, that it covers panel discussions, That's not to say that those panel discussions wouldn't have a disclosure, because they would. They would be saying this is media that we're not sure if it's true or not. They would still have that disclosure. It's just that if you take that, if it's omitted from the bill, then they can't do it at all. So really appreciate you just looking at that. And I did, in my written testimony, there is a suggestion of where that would fit in. So thank you again for allowing me to come in and just give you the broadcasters' perspectives, but we are very happy to support S23. So
Thank you. Appreciate your specific suggestion on language as well.
Yeah.
Are there any questions for Wendy? Rep. Pincinel?
Have you spoken to the Secretary of State's office about adding this language, and are they okay with that?
we have. And yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very
Thank you.
much. So, committee, we have a little bit of downtime right now, so we'll ask Autumn to take us off live